The heavy courtroom doors creaked open with a slow, deliberate moan. And then, silence. All heads turned. A German shepherd stepped inside, chest broad, tail still, eyes fixed forward. There was no leash, no handler in sight. Only the echo of his paws against the polished marble floor. It was as if he knew exactly where he was, exactly what he was walking into. In the defendant's chair, a man stiffened. The dog's eyes locked onto him, not with aggression, not with fear, but with something far more piercing. Recognition. A quiet gasp spread through the room like a ripple. A few jurors leaned in. The bailiff took an unconscious step closer to his holster, and the prosecutor's hand froze in mid-air as he reached for his notes. Only the judge dared to speak. His voice, deep and seasoned, cracked the silence like a stone thrown in still water. Whose dog is this? The dog didn't break his gaze, didn't flinch, didn't move. The man on trial, Carson Reeds, suddenly couldn't breathe. He was a decorated military contractor. On the outside, calm. On the inside, unraveling. 1 second passed, then 2. The dog took a single step forward. The court stenographer dropped her pen. Carson's fingers gripped the edge of the defense table like it might anchor him to reality. But nothing could stop what was happening, because that dog knew something. And now everyone in that courtroom knew it too. 2 hours earlier, the holding cell beneath the courthouse was quiet. A light buzz came from the flickering overhead bulb. Sergeant Daniel Riker sat on the cold bench, hands cuffed, wrists raw. His head was bowed, his face bruised. Not from a fight, but from the weight of everything he carried. He hadn't spoken. Since they brought him in, didn't say a word during transport. Not even when the guards sneered and asked what kind of cop gets arrested for obstruction of justice. He just sat there, hollow-eyed. Above him, the trial was underway. The man on the stand was Carson Reeds, a man Daniel once trusted. The courtroom was hearing lies, twisted truths, fabricated timelines, and Sergeant Daniel Riker had been silenced because the one piece of evidence that could destroy Carson's defense couldn't speak. It had 4 legs, a black saddleback, and eyes that had seen war. His name was Shadow, and no one knew where he was. They tried to retire Shadow after the last overseas deployment. Too much trauma, the vet had said. Too many night terrors. Too many scars, but Daniel refused. "Let me take him," he'd whispered. "He's the only one who saw what really happened." But no one listened. The records were sealed, the mission classified, and Shadow was placed into quarantine for behavioral reevaluation, Daniel protested. He filed forms, he wrote letters, he even begged his captain, all denied. And now, a year later, Carson Reeds was on trial, not for what he did on the battlefield, but for what he covered up after. A fellow soldier had died in the desert that night, an explosion, they claimed. But Daniel knew better. So did Shadow. But words can be twisted. Only a stare can tell the truth. Back upstairs, the judge had called for a recess. Carson's lawyer was smiling, confident. The witnesses had been soft, the evidence circumstantial. The charges might not stick, and then the doors opened and everything changed. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply walked to the center of the courtroom and stopped. All eyes followed him. The judge gestured to the bailiff, confused. "Is this part of your evidence?" The bailiff shook his head. "No, sir. I don't know where he came from." That's when the back door creaked open again. An old man stepped in, a cane in one hand, leash in the other. The leash was empty, but his eyes were wet. He looked directly at Daniel's attorney, then the judge. "I think, Your Honor, this dog belongs in this courtroom." The judge blinked. "And you are?" "Retired Corporal Mason Dyer," the man said, voice shaking. "I was with Riker and Reeds in Ghazni province. I trained Shadow." He looked down at the dog who hadn't moved. "And if he's here, it's because he remembers something." The judge sat back slowly. "Proceed." Carson shifted in his chair. Then, like he could smell the fear, the dog moved. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. He walked directly to Carson, paused, and then tilted his head. just a fraction. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The same signal he used during search and rescue. The one that meant danger. A low murmur swept through the courtroom. Then, the dog moved again. He circled once, sat and stared straight at Carson. A stare that dug deeper than any cross-examination could. A stare that carried blood, betrayal, and memory. Carson's face twisted. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He reached for a glass of water, but his hand was trembling. Shadow never blinked, and somewhere beneath the courtroom floor, Daniel Riker exhaled. He didn't know why, but something had shifted. Back in the gallery, Corporal Mason leaned forward, voice rough. He never stares like that unless he smells guilt. The judge hesitated. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, we request a delay in further proceedings. We need time to review this development. The judge nodded. Granted. But as the courtroom emptied, Shadow stayed. He never took his eyes off Carson, even as the bailiff nudged him gently, even as the lights dimmed. He sat, statue still, unyielding, like a soldier guarding the truth. Below in the cell, Daniel finally looked up. The faintest sound reached his ears, mid claws on concrete. Footsteps, a silhouette rounded the corner. And then a tail wagged. Shadow stood at the cell bars, eyes full. Daniel dropped to his knees, hands still cuffed. You found him, he whispered, tears sliding down his cheeks. The old dog pressed his muzzle against the bars, and Daniel broke. All of the fear, the betrayal, the silence, gone because Shadow was here, and everything was about to change. Daniel Riker sat on the floor of the holding cell, arms resting on his knees, wrists still bound in cuffs. Across the iron bars, Shadow lay quietly, head down, eyes never leaving Daniel. No bark, no sound, only presence. It had been 13 months since they were separated, 13 months since that mission in Ghazni province. And now, the dog that saved. His life that saw everything and was here. Daniel whispered through the lump in his throat, How'd you even find me, buddy? Shadow just blinked, slow and deliberate, like he understood everything and needed no reply. It was always like that between them, no commands, no shouting, just eyes, breath, silence. That was enough. Their bond wasn't trained. It was earned. Flashback. 1 year earlier, the desert was unforgiving. Ghazni, Afghanistan. A convoy rolled through the valley, wheels crunching over broken gravel and sun-baked dirt. Inside one of the armored vehicles sat Sergeant Daniel Riker and K9 Shadow, both clad in gear, both sweating under the weight of what they carried. The radio cracked with static. Then silence. Daniel felt it first, that itch in the back of his skull, the kind that never showed up on radar or maps. Shadow felt it too, his ears perked, then flattened. He stared out the window, growled low. The vehicle jerked to a stop. Something wrong with your mutt? Carson Reeds asked from the opposite seat, raising an eyebrow. Daniel's voice was steady. He's never wrong. But Carson didn't listen. Minutes later, the ground behind them exploded. The third Humvee, gone. The air turned to fire, screams, chaos, smoke everywhere. But Shadow didn't flinch. He pulled forward, straining against his leash, dragging Daniel into the blast zone. They found Private Malley beneath the wreckage, still breathing, and that night, Shadow didn't sleep. He paced the outpost perimeter, ears sharp, nose twitching, at every gust of wind, like he knew something else was coming. It did, and this time it wasn't from the enemy. Days later, a report came in. The attack had been coordinated from inside the compound. Someone had tipped off the enemy about their convoy route. Daniel heard whispers, then silence, then lies. The footage was gone. The radio logs erased, and Carson Reeds promoted. Back to present, Daniel rubbed his thumb against the edge of his cuffs, jaw clenched. He hadn't spoken the full truth back then. No one would listen anyway. He had no proof, just gut, memory, and a German shepherd who remembered everything. They shipped Shadow off, classified him unstable, said he was too aggressive, too unreliable for further duty. Daniel knew better. That dog had seen betrayal up close, and it stuck to his brain. Like the smell of blood, Upstairs, the courtroom echoed with murmurs. After the recess, tension thickened like smoke. Everyone was talking about the dog, about that stare. The judge sat back on his bench, silent, reflective. Carson sat rigid in his seat, trying to play it calm, but his knee bounced under the table. His eyes darted every time the courtroom door creaked. He knew what that dog saw, and it terrified him. A few minutes later, Daniel was brought into the courtroom, still cuffed, flanked by guards. But something had changed in his walk. He wasn't slumped anymore. He was standing straighter, not defiant, just certain. Shadow walked beside him, unleashed. No words were exchanged, just that quiet harmony between soldier and dog. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, we ask the court's permission to call Sergeant Riker to the stand. In light of this new development." The judge didn't hesitate. "Proceed." The courtroom turned silent. Daniel sat in the witness chair. The cuffs came off. The prosecutor stepped forward slowly. "Sergeant Riker, I know this is difficult, but can you tell us what happened on the night of October 14th last year in Ghazni?" Daniel didn't look at the jury, didn't look at Carson. He looked down at Shadow, sitting by his boot, alert, then back at the prosecutor. "I followed orders. We were supposed to sweep a ridge. Intel said it was clear." Shadow picked up something, a scent, a vibration, I don't know. But he knew. He swallowed. "And then the world blew up behind us," he paused. "Later that night I overheard Reeds making a call. It wasn't on military comms. He said something about making sure the third Humvee was at the back of the... That's the one that got hit." The courtroom tensed. "You reported this?" the prosecutor asked. Daniel nodded. "To my commanding officer. Then the next day I was pulled off active duty. My report vanished. Reeds was the only one left on record. And Shadow? They took him. Said he needed to be re-evaluated." "Why?" Daniel looked at Carson now. Because Carson was the one who signed the transfer papers. He was afraid of what Shadow would do. A pause. "And what would that be?" the prosecutor asked. Daniel didn't answer. He just nodded toward the dog. The courtroom door opened. The old corporal, Mason, stepped in again. In his hand, a weathered folder. "Permission to submit new evidence, Your Honor." The judge narrowed his eyes. "What is it?" Mason laid it on the table. Security footage, not from military archives, from a private contractor. They recorded the entire conversation between Reeds and his contact. Shadow was right there. He turned to Daniel. "He remembered the compound name. That's how I found the server." The judge raised a hand. "Bring it forward." The bailiff carried the folder to the bench. The moment it touched the judge's desk, Carson stood. "Your Honor, this is an ambush. You can't just accept unknown evidence." But the judge had already opened it. Inside were screenshots. Clear. Dated. Tagged Reeds, a satellite phone. A message time-stamped just hours before the blast. The room stilled. Shadow didn't move. The judge stared hard at the man in the defendant's chair, and for the first time that day, Carson Reeds dropped his eyes. Outside the courtroom, a crowd had gathered. Journalists, veterans, families of soldiers who never came home. Everyone was waiting. Waiting for justice. Waiting for the truth. And a German shepherd named Shadow had just put a crack in the armor of silence that had held for far too long. Daniel sat quietly, hand resting gently on the dog's back. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Shadow had done it for him. The courtroom was still echoing with the judges. Words when the betrayal revealed itself in full. Mr. Reeds remained seated. "Bailiff, confiscate his phone." Carson's face drained of color. He didn't fight, didn't speak, just watched as the bailiff approached like a shadow he couldn't escape. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his seat, heart pounding. Not with triumph, but with something far deeper. Grief, the kind that comes when justice finally peeks through, but too late for the ones who never came home. The prosecutor handed the judge a transcript. The call was traced to a number linked to a foreign contractor previously flagged in a congressional inquiry. "This was no miscommunication, Your Honor. This was a setup." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Families of the fallen, veterans who had served under Carson, and reporters scribbling without blinking. And yet, in all the chaos, Shadow remained still, except his eyes. They were locked again, on Carson unblinking. Like a soul recognizing a sickness. Outside the courtroom, Corporal Mason sat in the hallway, shoulders hunched, phone pressed to his ear. "She's not answering," he said. "I've tried 3 times. From the other end, static, then a voice. She's gone, Mason. Eleanor Riker left the apartment 2 days ago." "What?" "Said she couldn't handle the pressure anymore. Too many reporters, too many threats. Someone's been watching her." Mason's blood ran cold. They weren't just targeting Daniel anymore. This went deeper, much deeper. He hung up and turned toward the courtroom doors just as they opened. 2 military men in polished uniforms stood on either side of the entrance. Not officers, not MPs, private security, and they were not there to protect Daniel. Inside, Carson Reed stood slowly. "Your Honor," he began, voice trembling with manufactured humility, "I have served this country for 22 years. These allegations, based on corrupted footage and a dog's behavior, are an insult." The judge didn't flinch. "Do you deny placing the call to the foreign contractor the night of the ambush?" "I do." "You were warned about that route being compromised?" "No, we had clearance from—" "Then explain the deleted comm logs, the altered convoy maps, the sudden reassignment of Sergeant Riker, and the reclassification of his K9 partner as unstable just 24 hours after his report." A pause. Carson's eyes shifted, not to the judge, to the gallery, to someone watching from the back, a man in a dark suit, unblinking. Daniel caught it, a subtle nod, a flicker of something exchanged between them. This wasn't just about Carson, it was about whatever Carson was protecting, and whoever was protecting him. Corporal Mason burst into the courtroom. "Your Honor, I need to speak with the defense, privately." "It's urgent." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is this related to the case?" Mason didn't even blink. "It's about a threat on Sergeant Riker's family." Silence fell like a blade. Daniel's body tensed. "What?" Mason rushed forward and whispered fast, "Your wife, she's missing. Apartment's empty. Landlord says she left with no notice. I think someone's scared of what's about to come out." Daniel's heart dropped into a pit. Everything he feared was unfolding. First the setup, then the cover-up. Now, the silence of his own family, and through it all, Shadow remained still, but his muscles had tightened, his breathing sharper. He sensed it too. This wasn't over. This was the start. That night, Daniel was escorted back to his temporary holding cell, but this time, 2 guards followed him into the hallway. Not jail guards, military. They said it was for his protection, but Daniel recognized the insignia. They weren't from the local base. These were contractors. Government adjacent, no names, no rank. He paused at the doorway, looked back at Shadow. "You're not leaving my side again," he muttered. "The dog." The contractors hesitated. "That animal isn't cleared," for Daniel stepped between them. "He's my partner, and if he leaves my sight, so help me—" "Sergeant Riker," one of them interrupted. "We're only following orders." Daniel's voice dropped low. "So was I, and look where that got us." Silence. They relented. Shadow followed him in. The door closed, and inside that sterile grey cell, Daniel sat in silence, holding on to one truth. Shadow had already exposed one betrayal, but the real enemy was still out there, watching, waiting. In the shadows of a quiet office across town, a phone buzzed. The man from the courtroom gallery, the one in the black suit, picked it up. "It's moving faster than we anticipated," he said. On the other end, a smooth voice replied, "Then slow it down. We can't have a decorated officer's name smeared publicly. It compromises the entire operation. There's a dog involved." A pause. "The German Shepherd?" "Yes." He stared down Reed's. Made the judge second-guess everything. "It's not just what he saw. It's what the public thinks he saw." The voice went quiet. Then, "Handle it, before he becomes a martyr. Or worse, a hero." The line went dead, and somewhere in a hidden file marked classified, Shadow's name was quietly moved to a new category. Back in the holding cell, Daniel lay awake. Shadow's head rested across his boots. He could feel it now, like before the ambush. Something coming, something cold. He whispered, They're going to try again. Shadow's ears twitched. Daniel sat up slowly. You were right about Reeds. But this goes higher, doesn't it, boy? Shadow rose, walked to the cell door and sat, eyes fixed on the hallway. Waiting, just like before, waiting for the betrayal to come around again. And it would. But this time, the dog wouldn't just stare, he would act. The courtroom returned to session the next morning under heavier security. Uniforms lined the halls, metal detectors buzzed louder. Reporters were kept further back. Something had shifted, not just in public interest, but in the air itself. And yet, Shadow walked beside Daniel as if nothing had changed, head low, eyes sharp. The leash didn't lead him, he led it, because he knew today wouldn't end quietly. As Daniel stepped into the courtroom, his eyes scanned the gallery. Still no sign of Eleanor, still no word. But a new face had appeared in her place. Woman mid-40s, civilian clothes, military posture, and her eyes locked on Shadow the moment he entered, not with fear, with recognition. Daniel slowed. Shadow stopped. For a heartbeat, the courtroom faded. He stared at her, head tilted, breathing slow. Then his lip twitched. Not a growl. Not aggression. Memory. The woman swallowed hard. She stood. Your Honor, she said, voice firm, I request to speak as a surprise witness. Gasps again. The judge narrowed his eyes. On whose behalf? The woman's gaze didn't leave the dog. On behalf of the truth. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Erica Vale, and she was the operations handler for the classified convoy the night of the ambush, or had been. She resigned a week later. No one had heard from her since, until now. I kept quiet for years because I thought silence would protect the men who survived, she began, standing in front of the courtroom, voice brittle but unshaking. But watching that dog walk into this room, and seeing the way he looked at the accused, I realized silence is what killed the others. She turned slowly to Carson Reeds. Captain Reeds was never supposed to be there that night. He rerouted the convoy last minute, ordered Sergeant Riker into the front vehicle with the K9, which should have been in the rear, standard protocol. The judge sat forward. And why was that order significant? Because he knew the front vehicle would be hit first. Silence. Total. You could hear the breath catch in the throat of 100 people. Erica took out a drive from her pocket. This contains recordings, not just logs, but live audio. Objection. Overruled. The drive was inserted. The audio played. And the voice was unmistakable. Carson Reeds. Let them take the hit. The dog will draw them out, then we send in the cleanup. The judge's hand tightened around his gavel. In the gallery, a mother of one of the fallen soldiers wept. Daniel closed his eyes. Shadow pressed his body against his leg. And then, the last line on the tape, a whisper. From Reeds. That shepherd is a liability. Get rid of him once this is done. Chaos exploded. Reeds lunged forward. That tape is doctored. I demand it be dismissed. The judge slammed the gavel. Enough! But no one was looking at him anymore. All eyes had turned to Shadow, because he was no longer calm. He stood, tall, rigid, eyes burning holes into the man in front of him. A low, guttural growl rose from his throat, one that shook the courtroom. But Daniel didn't stop him. He couldn't. This wasn't an attack. This was memory turning into judgment. Carson froze. You trained him to detect aggression, didn't you, Sergeant Riker? Daniel's voice was cold. Not just aggression. Then what? Guilt. Gasps. Shadow inched forward, but not out of control. Every move was measured, deliberate, like he'd waited years for this moment. A bailiff stepped between them, hand on weapon, but the judge raised his hand. Stand down. This court will not interfere with the actions of a decorated K9 unless danger is proven. And yet, Shadow never lunged. He simply stood in front of Carson Reeds and stared, one long, eternal look that stripped away every medal, every lie, every mask, and in that silence, Carson began to shake. I didn't mean to kill them, he stammered. It was a tactical error. We were promised intel. But you ordered the change, Erica snapped. I had no choice. You think I wanted those men to die? You think I wanted this dog to live so he could haunt me?" He turned suddenly, screaming at Shadow. "You were supposed to die in that blast." The entire courtroom recoiled, and then Shadow barked, not a warning, not fear, testimony. The judge stood. "I believe the truth has now fully come to light." Daniel didn't move. His heart thundered, his legs ached. But Shadow didn't blink, didn't look away. Even as Reeds collapsed into his seat, even as handcuffs clicked shut, even as guards pulled him away, Shadow watched, because justice wasn't about punishment. It was about recognition, about being seen, heard, understood. And in that moment, for the first time since the explosion, Daniel felt understood. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed, but Daniel didn't speak, he just walked, one hand resting on Shadow's back, the leash slack, the air calmer. And behind them, the woman, Erica, stood at the top of the courthouse steps. Didn't call after them, didn't interrupt, she just whispered into the wind, "Good boy." And Shadow paused, just once, ears twitching, as if to say, "I heard you." Then he walked on, back into the quiet. But the war wasn't over, because something else still lingered, something Daniel couldn't shake, a missing wife, a growing silence, and a shadow that hadn't disappeared. It had only stepped back into the dark, waiting. The courtroom was empty now. The truth had landed like a bomb, stripping titles, tearing open buried sins, and leaving only fragments behind. Carson Reeds had been escorted out in cuffs, his trial postponed for military court. The prosecution's case against Daniel Riker was formally dropped, though the word vindicated never felt so hollow, because something else, someone else, was still missing. Eleanor. Daniel sat on the courthouse steps, alone but for Shadow, whose breathing had finally slowed. In the distance, cameras flashed. Reporters called out, he heard none of it. All he heard was the voicemail Eleanor had left him 3 nights ago. "I'm scared, Danny. I think someone's following me. Someone from your past. Please, call me back." He had, twice, no answer. And Tamasu, nothing. That night, back at his small apartment, he left the door unlocked. Shadow lay at the entrance, eyes open, ears alert. There was no sleep, only silence, and questions that felt like bullets ricocheting in his skull. Who had been following her? Why now? What did she know that he didn't? And what if? A knock at the door. Shadow didn't bark. He stood, every muscle tense, tail low. Not scared. Ready, Daniel approached, body moving before his brain caught up. He opened the door slowly, and froze. Eleanor. But not the same. Hair messy, eyes red, clothes torn, and standing beside her, bloodied, limping, panting, another German. Shepherd. Shadow rushed forward and stopped dead. He didn't growl, he whined. The dog barked once, then collapsed. They got her inside. Daniel barely spoke, hands trembling as he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Eleanor, what happened?" She clutched his arm. Her voice cracked. "They tried to kill me, Danny. They followed me after I went to see Erica. I thought if I stayed away from you, they'd stop, but they didn't." Her hand moved to the other dog, now curled on the floor next to Shadow. "He saved me. He found me hiding in an alley. I think he was trained, like Shadow." Daniel knelt. The second dog had a faint tattoo inside the ear. Military issued, no tags, no collar, just a survivor, like them. 2 hours later, Erica Vale arrived. She hadn't been summoned, but something told her to come. When she saw the second dog, her face went white. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's Jax. He was part of Reed's private canine unit. We thought he died in the same blast." Daniel frowned. "Then why help Eleanor?" Erica's voice was cold. "Because not all dogs obey monsters. Some remember who they were before." The pieces started falling into place. Reeds had tried to erase witnesses, but Jax had escaped, probably wounded, hunted, and now drawn to Eleanor, maybe by scent, maybe by instinct, and that meant something dangerous. Reeds wasn't the only one. Involved, he had help. People who still wanted Eleanor gone, and by now, they knew she was alive. Daniel packed a duffel, loaded Shadow into the jeep. He turned to Eleanor. "You need to leave. Tonight." She looked up. "I'm not running again." "You're not running. You're surviving. Like we always have. She opened her mouth, then stopped. She saw it in his eyes. He wasn't coming with her. Her hand gripped his sleeve. "Don't you dare do this alone." "I won't," Daniel said. He looked at Shadow. "I've got him." And then he glanced at Jax, bloodied, weakened, but standing, head lifted, ears forward. Daniel gave a single nod. "You too?" The dog limped to his side. "Answer enough." They drove for hours, south, away from the city, toward an old airstrip once, used for military ops. It was shut down, forgotten, but not to Reed's people. This was where the convoy had been rerouted years ago, where the ambush had begun, and maybe, just maybe, where it could finally end. Daniel stepped out into the blackness. No streetlights, no moon, just metal skeletons of old hangars. He had no weapon, just a flashlight. But Shadow and Jax moved beside him like they'd trained for this moment. And deep inside Hangar 3, a voice echoed, "I should have known you'd." "Come." Daniel's heart dropped, because it wasn't Reed's. It was someone higher, Brigadier Hale, the same man who'd handed Daniel the dishonorable discharge, the same man who'd signed Reed's reassignment orders, the real puppet master. "You think dogs can win a war?" Hale scoffed from the shadows. "You think justice is barking in a courtroom?" Daniel said nothing. He just stepped aside. And in that moment, Shadow surged forward, not to attack, but to stop. He barked, once, twice, and out of the shadows, more barking, from behind crates, from corners, from the dark, more dogs, rescued, retired. Forgotten canines released days ago by Erica and her network, reunited here, not to fight, but to witness, to testify. As Daniel turned on the flashlight, its beam fell across Hale's uniform, and something else. Trembling hands, a weapon lowered, and for the first time, a man surrounded by trained killers realized they wouldn't need to bite. They'd already judged, and Hale was guilty. A shot rang out, but not from Hale. A figure from behind had tried to silence him, another officer loyal to Reed's, but Jax leapt, took the bullet, and didn't fall. He lunged, dragging the gunman to the floor, snarling, pinning him down. With teeth to the throat, he didn't kill, just held, until the others swarmed in and took him away. Daniel knelt beside Jax, blood on his side, eyes blinking slow. Eleanor arrived seconds later, tears on her cheeks. "No, no, no, no." But Jax looked at her, then at Shadow, then at Daniel, and let out a quiet breath, like peace, like home, then stillness. The airstrip fell silent. The barking stopped, and every dog, every soul stood still, in honor, not of the mission, but of the sacrifice, because one dog had chosen redemption over rage, and in doing so, had saved them all. Weeks passed. The trial that once branded Daniel Riker a criminal had vanished from headlines, replaced by stories of corruption, heroism, and a dog named Jax. But no one talked about what happened afterward, because some stories don't end with applause. They end in silence. Daniel stood alone at the edge of a field behind the Canine Rehabilitation Center. The grass was overgrown, the trees untouched. It was where the military used to bring dogs to train. Where Jax had likely once obeyed his first command. Now, it was where they laid him to rest. The plaque read only one word: loyalty. Shadow sat beside Daniel, head bowed, tail still. They hadn't moved in over an hour. Daniel finally spoke, only a whisper. "He saved her, you know." Shadow didn't move. Daniel's voice broke. "He saved all of us." A breeze passed through, rustling nothing but the silence in Daniel's chest. He wiped his face with a calloused hand. Not from tears, from dust. But still his eyes stayed red. Eleanor walked up behind them quietly, a folded American flag in her arms. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She placed the flag at the base of the plaque, then knelt and ran her hand over the engraved metal. "I looked it up," she said. "Jax's original handler died in the same convoy ambush. That dog, he must have roamed for years, hurt, forgotten, waiting for someone to command him again." Daniel stared at the plaque. No, he wasn't waiting. Eleanor turned. He was deciding. Daniel's voice deepened, whether the world was still worth protecting. The days blurred after that. Reed's court-martial was quiet. Closed door, no cameras. Erica Vale submitted all evidence. Shadow's behavior in court, Eleanor's testimony, even Jax's military record. When she was done, the room had gone silent. The judge didn't bang a gavel. He just stood, saluted Jax's file, and walked away. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it just nods and leaves the door open behind it. Daniel never wore the uniform again. He didn't return to patrol, didn't apply for a badge, didn't ask for compensation, but people still recognized him. In the grocery store, at the gas station, even at the dog park, where Shadow became something of a legend. They called him the man whose dog saved a courtroom. But Daniel always corrected them. He didn't save the courtroom, he saved the truth. One evening, months later, Daniel found a letter in his mailbox. No return address, just a wax seal, the emblem of the U.S. Army K-9 Division. Inside was a single photo, Jax in uniform, standing tall beside his original handler, both looking into the camera as if they already knew how their story would end. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note. Some dogs never forget who they are. Some men don't either. There was no signature. Daniel stared at the photo for a long time, then placed it in a wooden frame and set it next to Shadow's water bowl. Every morning after that, he touched it once before taking Shadow on a walk, and every night he said the same 5 words out loud, even if no one else could hear. Thank you for coming back. Years passed. The world moved on. Courts filled with new cases. News feeds scrolled with louder stories. People forgot, but not all. Sometimes a veteran would come to the rehab center with a limp and a shattered heart, and they'd ask for the dog, who stared down a liar in court and tore open the truth. Daniel would smile softly and point to Shadow. Sometimes the veteran would shake his hand. Sometimes they'd cry. Sometimes they just sat beside the grave with the plaque that said loyalty, and somehow that was enough. One day Eleanor asked a question she hadn't dared speak in years. Do you think we'll ever know why Jax found me that night? Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked out the window of their small home where Shadow lay sunbathing on the porch like royalty. Then he said it. I think he didn't find you. I think he chose you. Eleanor smiled, but her eyes filled, and for the first time in a long while she let the tears fall, not from pain but from grace. The final image, a sunrise over the field where Jax rests. The grass is trimmed now, the trees blooming. Shadow stands beside the plaque, older now, slower, but still watching, still waiting. And beside him a little girl, Eleanor's niece, kneels and reads the word on the plaque aloud. Loyalty. Then she looks up at Shadow and whispers something no one can hear. Shadow responds the only way he knows how, by lying, down beside her, pressing gently into her side, as if to say, the torch is yours now, carry it well, and never forget the ones who came before. The screen fades to black, no music, no applause, just silence, and a single line in white text. Some heroes wear badges, others wear fur, but all of them remember.